The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On this week's episode, we're joined by Dev Jain. Dev Jain is the CEO and founder of RailVision Analytics, a startup developing in-cab technology for passenger and freight trains. RailVision's EcoRail app directly reduces fuel consumption and GHG emissions through improved train handling. Under Jain's leadership, EcoRail has garnered industry recognition and attracted major players like Via Rail, Metrolinx, and Genesee in Wyoming, delivering impressive fuel savings of up to 15%. Jain's accolades include grants from Montreal Incorporated, Centec, and Dobson Cup, along with a Green Innovation Award from Cycle Monumentum, showcasing his commitment to innovation and sustainability. Now let's get into this week's episode with Dev.
Welcome back, and we have our guest back with us, Dev Jain, the CEO and founder of RailVision, and really looking forward to this second podcast because we've got some additional questions that we weren't able to ask in our first one. So welcome back, Dev, and appreciate you being with us today. I've had the opportunity to ask the first question. With the work that we do, we are really dependent on data. And so why do you think there's so many corporations that are data shy or don't use the data?
I think it's just more complicated than it seems from the get-go. So when we say data, right? I mean, there's obviously loads of data that's collected throughout a business in many ways, and that can appear in many forms, right? It can be data related to people, right? Like personal data. It can be, in our case, we use what we call time series data, which is at a certain timestamp, there's signals that are reporting. I'll bring it back to us again. Related to railroads, you can have track data. What does the track look like, which is just a static data format. So there's various different forms of data that could be used by a company. I think one of the reasons why companies are very data shy is because it's not obvious how doing something about that data delivers some sort of value to the company. It's nice to have data. I think there was a time where it was very trendy for people to say, big data, we're just doing something related to our data. But when there's really no result around driving some change out of that data, I think it creates a bit of a turn off as to, well, why should we really dig into that data in the first place? And honestly, I would suggest that for any company who's just trying to do any data project, first figure out why.
In the first episode, you talked about how you work with rail industry, and you made quite an interesting separation between the person who buys the system and the operator of it. But we didn't really talk about what kind of rail companies you work with. And with that, I'm interested in who is it, for example, who's the customer? What role are they? Are they in finance, operations, whatever? Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So I'll start with which railroads we work with. So we work across all segments of the rail industry, those being commuter, passenger rail, like long distance passenger rail. And then within freight, you could break it up into various segments, mainline traffic, mining railroads, switching railroads. So we really have a customer in every segment of the rail industry. In terms of who is the customer or who is the person that we're selling to, it depends company to company because not every single company has the same structure, right? Or the same people, the same roles. So sometimes it's someone in finance, sometimes it's someone more on the transportation side or something more operational. And sometimes there's a head of sustainability type role that has an interest as well. So our sales process usually involves speaking to the people who have the most to gain from it, right? Who's responsible for the fuel budget, right? Who's responsible for the finances? Who's responsible for saving greenhouse gas emissions? The people that are responsible for those aspects of the entire company, those are the people that we are usually selling to. But again, as we chatted about earlier, those are usually the people not using the product. The people who are using the product are the locomotive engineers and really the crews that are operating the trains.
Thank you.
Dev, just picking up on that, are you selling North American wide, worldwide? What's your marketplace that you're targeting?
Right now, we're only in North America. We definitely want to expand globally, but I think there's still plenty of opportunity for us in North America. So we're really just focused here. I'll answer a question that you didn't ask, but in between, so sometimes people ask a little bit about Canada versus the U.S. Are we only in Canada, only in the U.S., so on and so forth. In North America, it's generally one rail industry, right? There's some slight regulatory differences, but for the most part, it's really one rail industry. The same way, Western Europe is kind of one rail industry. Now, there's different rules between each country, but it's really one that, Eastern Europe, I'd say, then breaks up into a number of segments. The same way I would say the UK is kind of its own rail industry. It's not the same thing as Western Europe's rail industry. So we can kind of bucket these countries and continents into different parts of the global market. But for right now, we're really just focused on the North American aspect. For the most part, just out of proximity, that's where we are. That's where we already have a good customer base. And so trying to capitalize on that opportunity before going global.
And if I could pick up on that, like how big is the rail industry? Like how many companies or organizations are there in North America that you could be potential customers?
Yeah, in North America, there's over 600 railroads.
Oh,
Now, of course, there are 6 that are the class 1s that essentially have the majority of the market share in freight, but there's that other nearly 600 that are what we call short line operations or regional operations. They're responsible for smaller moves. It can be switching operations, but sometimes it can be decent volume mainline traffic across a state, interconnecting with a class 1 operation. And then, of course, we have all of our passenger railroads as well. Those can be commuter operations, those can be metro operations, or they can be long distance passenger. Like in Canada, we have Via Rail, in the States, Amtrak.
Really interesting. So my next question to you is kind of changing the subject matter a wee bit. It's still staying with data. In your modeling, and that's my understanding, you have modeling that actually predicts best practices running the locomotive at different times, starts, stops. In your model, do you use static data? Do you have data from the past and then you just do your model? Or is the model evolving? Because I know rail that doesn't make a lot of changes, except there could be changes. They could do modifications to the rail in some factor that could impact your modeling. Do you upgrade, or how often you're changing your data or your modeling based on what's going on in the industry?
Sure. So the answer is both. And in terms of the frequency on which we're updating our models, it's as frequent as new data comes in. So very, very frequent. Customer to customer, obviously that depends, but on an hourly basis, on a daily basis, as often as data comes in. When I say both, there's a lot of static data we use as well. So maybe I'll take a step back and kind of break down a lot of the data sources that are available to us. So I'll start with all the static pieces, right? The track. The track can change, yes, but generally we consider it a static data source. So where the track is, what the grade of the track is, where, if this is a passenger operation, where are the stations? Those are things that generally don't change. So we set it up once, and then we only reset it up every time there's some change. A new station's added, construction made the track, change, deviate from what it originally was. So those are some of the static data sources. Actually, I'll keep going. There's some other static data sources as well. For example, what the train makeup is, what we call in the rail industry the consist, right? So what is the consist? How many locomotives? How many rail cars? What's the weight of that train? Obviously, that's changing on a day-to-day basis, but during a trip, it's not changing. Right. Sorry, even that it can change, but if there's dropped off cars or picked up cars, you're resetting up the consist, right? So over the duration of a movement from start to stop, generally speaking, or at least hopefully, your train consist is not changing during that time.
Right.
So that's also something that's very static. When we get into more of the dynamic data sources, so data that's continuously updating with time, now we're talking about essentially 2 data sources or two devices. Right. So one, as you might have guessed, is coming off of the locomotive. So from the locomotive, we get what we call time series data. So for a timestamp, what are all the signals in the locomotive? So that can tell us what's the speed of the train, what throttle are they in, how much brakes are they applying, everything down to are the headlights on or off, right? Now we don't use those in fuel savings, but you get the point of there's various data sources there. So all of that is one device. And then another device that people sometimes forget about, but it's our actual product, the tablet, right? The tablet can also report to us at what time, where am I? right? At what time, what is my speed? So essentially using all of these data sources together is how we form some of the underlying models as to how to drive the train in the most efficient way.
Just to follow up on that, so with locomotive technology, is it changing that much? So as new locomotives come in, does the performance of the trains change drastically on the energy usage requirements?
Yeah, it does. I definitely wouldn't consider myself an expert in that space,
Yeah.
but from kind of my surface knowledge of it, it does change quite a considerable amount in specific areas. One area that you would think it would change a lot, but it doesn't, is its actual fuel efficiency.
Okay.
The newer locomotives aren't actually that much more fuel efficient, surprising. They are incrementally, but they're not significantly more fuel efficient. As with, cars, if you think about a car that you've maybe had 20 years ago versus a car that you have today, it's probably, double the efficiency minimum,
Right.
right?
Right.
So it's actually not changing that much in locomotives. What does change a lot is emissions, right? Old locomotives are seen to have like very dirty pollutants. Again, I'm not really an expert in the space, but this is definitely a big change. There's the introduction of, for example, diesel exhaust fluid. This is something that in 40-year-old locomotives they don't have, right? So you have heavy pollutants that are being emitted from the locomotive versus today's locomotives are releasing significantly greener greenhouse gas emissions.
Got it.
Yeah, so I would say there's a decent amount of locomotive advancement, but it's not as fast as you would think, and I think that's a lot to do with sort of the life cycle of a locomotive. I would guess a car's average lifespan is maybe something like 15 years. I would guess a truck's is larger, but maybe on the order of magnitude of 25 years, something like that, 25, 30 years.
Right.
Locomotives is more on the magnitude of something like 50 years.
Wow.
So the actual recycling of locomotives, how many new locomotives is a company purchasing? It's not very high. You'd see a lot of rail operations that are going on right now where the entire fleet is locomotives that are, minimum 30 years old, if not even more. Some of them 40, 50 years old.
Right. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you touched on an interesting point there, and about the other emissions from diesel engines in particular. And one of the things we know with the European standards is fuel economy hasn't increased as much as it could because an element of your fuel economy has been taken up by cleaning up the other pollutants. So
Yeah.
I think your point is well made there, and I think it's an interesting thing. It's a bit of a sideline here, but our government at one point was all for diesel for passenger cars, and I had a
Yeah.
diesel for some time. When I got round to renewing it, they changed the tax model, they changed everything, and they gone diesel, dirty, disgusting. We don't want diesel. We want hybrid or EV. And so, but diesel is still a very useful source of energy for traction. So, yeah, it makes sense there. So moving on to my question, clearly we know from what we've talked about with you that the key thing you're reporting on is litres of fuel used. When you're doing your reporting, do you report anything else? Do you undertake the conversion to GHG, or is that left to the user? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we report on the GHG emissions as well. So we have like sort of standard calculations that are reporting on the GHG emissions. Some of the
Yeah.
other items that we report on, somewhat related to the fuel aspect, but you'll see a slight deviation on that. Things like compliance, right? Did people follow the recommendations or not, right? It's one thing to save fuel,
Right.
but did you follow the recommendations perfectly and save no fuel? Did you follow the recommendations not at all and save fuel? Or did you not follow any of the recommendations and not save fuel, which is the most common one, right? No
So that's
recommendations were
performance
followed.
reporting, really,
No
isn't it?
fuel. Exactly. So it's performance reporting on product usage ultimately. So that's a piece of reporting that we use as well. And then I would say one other indicator that's reported on quite a bit is time, how long something took. Because at the end of the day, and this is the equivalent in your car, you could save a lot of fuel in your car if you drove half the speed, right? If
So
you
true.
aim to get everywhere super, super late in life, you do fine on sustainability, right? But there's a trade-off between, do you
Yeah.
want to show up on time or do you want to save fuel? So this is also a very key point, because our goal is to not waste time, right? We want to get someone to their destination in the same amount of time and have fuel savings. Now, with certain companies that we work with, they say, even that we prioritize fuel savings a little bit more. We can afford a little bit more time if you're promising us, now a significantly large number, 10% more savings. If we just took 5% more time, yeah, that's something of interest. So, but nonetheless, it's one of sort of the key indicators that we report on as well, to show the fuel savings, but as well as that change in trip duration.
Yeah, that's an interesting one here, because a big issue for our rail network is passenger rail network, that is reporting on punctuality, and there are
Yep,
penalties on the companies. For example, if you have a season ticket and the performance is down, you can get a refund. If you travel a journey and it's delayed over a certain time, you can get a refund. So you're right, you've got to balance those things. But I've not done this work within the rail industry, but I've been involved in a project with the Freight Transport Association here in the UK, and with driver training. And one of the things that he found was that an effective driver could still be on time and save fuel. It's the
definitely.
for want of a better word, in truck driving, it's the heavy-footed driver that you're trying to reform their behaviour, isn't it?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
goes back to our point of the majority of fuel savings come from the majority of your drivers driving like your
Yeah.
best driver, right?
Yeah.
Your best driver being a physical person, right? Someone who's actually driven the train, not a make-believe theoretical model of how to drive a train, just
Yes.
someone who's already out there driving the train. So yeah, definitely. And like we've worked a lot with Metrolinx, which is commuter rail. And Metrolinx very much so has a philosophy of, we're going to show up on time, it's down to the seconds, right?
Yeah.
Whereas other companies and freight may think more in terms of minutes or tens of minutes. Commuter rail operates on minutes down to seconds in terms of punctuality. But yet we still saw, again, there's loads of opportunity to save fuel and still arrive on time all the time.
Yeah.
And then again, this is kind of the tunnel vision, right? I think people oftentimes like to jump on this and say, oh, you're 3 seconds late, that's what's compiling all of the delays. The reality is it's mostly not the case, right? The case of delays is mostly other reasons, in passenger rail in North America specifically. The largest reason in North America, and I don't think this will come as a surprise as anyone, but it's due to the relationships between passenger railroads and freight railroads. In North
Right.
America, for the most part, it's freight railroads owning the track, with passenger railroads operating on a freight railroad's track. And so it
Got you.
comes down to prioritization, right? Generally speaking, passenger railroads don't get the prioritization that they need on a freight railroad's track. Why? Because of their track, right? They get to they get to set the rules. And so this is what creates loads of delays, specifically for our long distance passenger railroads in North America, Via Rail and Amtrak. This is the number one thing that plagues their punctuality, is the relationship with the freight railroads that own the track they're operating on.
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting, the contrast between UK and North America. I mean, we don't have
Yep.
rail journeys anywhere near the length of what you do. And having said I've done quite a bit of work with the rail industry, although not on the detail of what you're talking about. But what I do know there is that, interestingly enough, the majority of delays in this country occur from the rolling stock, the infrastructure, and
Yep.
occasional excursions of livestock onto lines and things like that. We don't have the same issue of a freight priority over passenger.
Yep.
But yeah,
No, exactly. In
interesting. Thank you.
in Europe, it's a different foundation, like a
Yes, it
different
is.
political foundation of the rail industry.
Yeah,
That's it. In North America, it's freight dominated, freight railroads owning all of the track. Whereas in Europe, it's mostly different, right? Again, Western Europe, it's mostly the government owning the track, the national government owning the track. In the UK, it's a little bit different. They've set up a sort of
yeah.
a private entity to own all the track, right? So, but yeah, it's in between North America and Europe, a totally different political foundation of the rail industry.
But I think the model that you're talking about, let's make it clear, I'm sure the model you're talking about works in these different jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, which model exactly?
The-
Like our business model, you're saying, or
Your
the
business
your
model.
your
yeah, our
model
business
of
model?
fuel saving. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that would
definitely. No,
translate
exactly.
quite happily across. Yeah.
Definitely, and generalized, it's about energy savings, right? So even if the train is electric, for example, it's the same concept. It's, still
Yes, it is,
electricity
isn't it?
costs money. Electricity is a
Yeah.
form of pollution, just not on the spot, but elsewhere. So at the end of the day, it's energy management.
Dev, we talked about this last podcast, but for us, we've always conveyed to clients like managing energy. There's just a great business case, and you conveyed that with your model. There's a range between 5 to 20% savings. So I have two questions related to that. Is that like an annual number? And then my follow up on that is, do you find the savings continue, or do drivers get better because of your model and the savings aren't as much? I'm kind of curious. My guess is the savings stay the same because they're reliant on your model and they don't really learn. They're dependent on your model to make sure they save. But I'm curious what you found.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the first piece, yeah, those are annualized numbers, 5 to 20%. In terms of, so it's kind of an interesting question you're asking about. It kind of touches on two things. The behavioral piece, right? Which is, in the absence of the product, once you've shown someone the product, you've shown them a way to drive more fuel efficiently, and then you remove the product, do they still drive fuel efficiently, or do they kind of go back to their ways? And in short, they go back to their ways for two reasons, right? One is the behavioral piece of the reminders and sort of the prioritization and the emphasis. Again, we chatted earlier about that. In our line of business, there's a difference between the customer and the user, right? The customer, the person paying for the product, is not the user in our case, and the user is not paying for the product, right? So there is an element of, well, if the user doesn't have the product anymore, it's not their incentive to sort of solve management's problems. Their incentive was just to use the product because they like using the product, right? So we usually see a decline in that regard when we remove the product. And I'd say the other piece is the variability in the operation. So some operations are very repeatable, right? So it's easier, so to speak, for someone to continue to do the same thing in the more efficient way, right? But in other operations, it's not as repeatable. Freight being the best example of that. Freight, your train's changing all the time, right? You have different numbers of locomotives, different numbers of rail cars, different train length, different weights. So the computation of how to drive the train in the most efficient way possible changes every single time you have a different train, right? So in the absence of the product, it's not that someone realized the more efficient way to drive and then can apply that forward. They need the computation on a regular basis to actually inform of the best way to drive.
You raise a really good point. So based on what you just said, do you find the stickiness of your product is even better with freight than it might be with passenger, just based on what you just said?
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely say that, but I would say the stickiness is very high in passenger as well. And I would attribute a lot of that to not just the fuel savings, but just the general usability of the app and the simplicity of the app. It's just Google Maps, right? I mean, I don't know if we have a screenshot here, but it's just like looking at Google Maps, right? You open it up, you see a map, you say, start a new trip, here's where I want to go, type in a few details, enter, let's go. So that usability and again, it seems like something so simple. Almost everyone has Google Maps or has used Google Maps or Waze or a form of mapping technology in their car. But in the rail industry, this has not existed, right? This was an industry where, there are paper printouts of what the operation looks like, and then let's go, eyes forward, that's it. So yeah, this is definitely as non-advanced as it seems to consumers of consumer products. For a business in the rail industry, this is actually very advanced.
Very good.
Okay, I'm asking you for a bit of future gazing here. From what I understand, your product is really good in diesel electric traction, and what we know from pressures of governments and other people that 100% electric is the low carbon future. That's clearly viable in metro systems, maybe not so much in long distance. But my question is, what is the future for non-direct electric traction in rail transport?
It's a really good question. Maybe I'll kind of say a little bit of a side thing, which is that
Yeah.
a lot of people think that the future of rail is electrification because that's sort of the trend of cars, right?
Yes.
And even that the trend of cars on that side can start to be a little bit debatable, right? We're seeing a little bit of fluctuation in the optimism around that vision. But the important thing to note about electrified trains is that electric trains have existed for a very, very long time, for hundreds of years, right? In fact, in
Yeah.
Europe, the majority of trains are already electrified. But this is not about electrifying the vehicle, right? You're not necessarily electrifying the locomotive as much as you're electrifying the infrastructure, right? And in Europe, we see that it's very apparent. There's overhead lines on almost
Yeah.
all rail lines, right? In North America, we don't have overhead lines, and that's due to a number of reasons. I'll point to some of the main ones. Freight, privatization, right? Privatization, freight, longer distances, less population density, so on and so forth. So in rail, it's hard to make the claim that we're just going to suddenly electrify everything because the option to electrify has just been sitting there forever, right? And we still haven't done it.
Yeah.
Whereas in cars, the option to electrify is, still relatively new, right? There's been advancements that have made it significantly more affordable to electrify a car. So yeah, I honestly wouldn't jump to the conclusion that the future of trains in North America is that suddenly everything's going to go electric. I don't think that's the future of trains. I think we're probably going to stay with diesel for a very long time. I think we'll see new advancements, won by our competitors, where there's an electric locomotive that fits into a consist with diesel locomotives. So you have a little bit of more emission savings there. I think that's a really great idea, but I don't think we're going to switch from diesel electric locomotives to fully electrified operations in the near future. And I don't think we need to as well, right? Diesel locomotives pulling goods by rail is still significantly more efficient than moving
Yeah.
goods by truck or by any road vehicle. Not to mention, we don't need to maintain the infrastructure. Public roads the same way private railroads are already maintaining their track. So I don't think it's the near-term future to switch away from diesel, but I also don't think it needs to be the near-term future in order to really reduce global emissions. I think creating technologies that create an environment where people choose to move goods by rail or choose to take the train as a passenger, I think that would definitely be the path to success on generally creating more sustainable transportation.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I personally, I can see where you're coming from on that, and we do have a slight issue with, shall we say, certain people in the sustainability field, that electricity is the answer for everything and now, and it's just not that easy and not that simple.
It's not that easy, but at the same time, I'd commend the people who are trying, because
Yeah.
doing anything with global impact is hard, right? So doing the optimal way and nailing it is very, very, very hard. Sometimes the second best way, or something that's good enough, and being able to execute on that is still well worth it, right? It still moves us forward over not doing anything.
We are at the end of our second podcast. I don't know, it's just flowing by. It's such an interesting topic, Dev. I want to thank you for this. What is the biggest takeaway for our listeners based on what we discussed in this second?
I'm not sure. I think we've chatted about a number of different things. I think I'd hone in on the piece around rail electrification and its necessity, and just the general industry dynamics of it, right? Again, in North America, electrification has been an option for 100 years. We have chosen not to electrify out of financial reasons, out of population density reasons, out of the structure of companies, privatized networks versus publicly owned networks. So we've had that option in front of us for a really long time, and we've chosen not to do it. So in the near term, we're likely not to suddenly electrify everything in North America, but at the same time, we don't need to, right? Rail transportation is 4 times more efficient than moving any goods by road, such as trucks. And I think the big opportunity from a sustainability standpoint is to think about how can we move more goods or move more people by train, more so than how do we try to undertake a massive revolution in the rail industry that doesn't necessarily have a strong argument for how that's going to improve sustainability.
John, how about yourself?
Well, Dev's taken the one I was going to go for, and that's his right. He's our guest, because I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the environmental benefits of moving, particularly transport to rail. With a 4-to-1 benefit, because a lot of people are going, well, electrification of heavy transport is a real problem. Well, we can go to 25% of the emissions by shifting to rail. That's that point. But I think the other point that I picked up on, and for something different, was that very interesting comment that if you take your tablet away, that people go back to the previous poor behaviour. And I think that is really interesting in terms of, if you're going to modify behaviour, you have to keep something in place to maintain that behaviour change.
Staying with that, John, we use this often that people will go after low-hanging fruit. I think, Dev, if I could say what you're 5 to 20% significant, deemed as low-hanging fruit, but it will grow back unless you go and keep picking it. So certainly that your product is doing that. My takeaway is that effectively you are using data, which most people don't, and you're using data that actually helps the engineer, the end use person do a job more effectively. And I think as much as a lot of people talk about data, it's not used that frequently, and certainly not used or understood by the end user frequently. It might be used by management, but not by the end user. So I think what you've done and what you've created with your company is friggin' brilliant. And I love that it's Canadian based. I love that it's come out of the work that you worked as an intern with Metrolinx. So I want to wish you all the best. I'll be watching very closely, because I think what you've got here is a really substantial product, and I'm sure the growth will be significant for you as you go forward. So I want to thank you for all your time and answering our questions with us today.
Well, thanks to the both of you as well for inviting me, and it was definitely a pleasure to discuss trains.
Yeah, it's been really, really good. It's nice to have an opportunity to discuss something like this. As we said before, I think there are people who are aware of rail. There are people who are not aware of rail, never use it. But even those that are aware of it don't look up, for want of a better word, they don't look under the covers to see what's there. And I think in a way we've had a really good look under the covers of the rail industry.
I'll say one small thing if we have the time, but the number of times I tell people about what we do, and they say, "Oh, you do that in Canada?" And I said, yeah, we have customers in Canada. They said, "I didn't even know there were any railroads in Canada."
No.
What they don't know is that 25% of our goods in Canada move by train.
Wow.
That's a great stat, actually. Very good.
Oh, we'll include that. We must include that.
We've got to include that, yeah. Wonderful. Thanks again, Dev. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dev.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.